Thanks for joining us. I'm Susan Lerner, Common Cause New York. I'm joined by David Daley, well-respected author and expert on many things democracy related. And before Dave and I start to discuss his new book, Unrigged, does that come out backwards?
No. No.
You can flip it.
Okay. For those of you who may not be as familiar with Zoom as you might like, I just wanted to review a couple of things just to let you know that if you run your cursor over the bottom of the screen, there are different icons that will come up. You can, right now, most of you are on mute, which is great, so you don't have to worry about background noise. You can even stop the video if you want, like Jerry Maslanka has done. And you will see that there is an icon for polling, and there's also one of those speech bubbles like you see in cartoons that says chat. And I'd like you to click on that, and the chat feature will come up. For some people, it's on the side of the screen. For other people, it's along the top. And as Dave and I talk about the book and the things that are covered in it, if you have questions that you'd like to raise, either comments or questions you'd like to ask Dave, throw them up in the chat. Our intrepid book event committee, which Common Cause New York is privileged to have some fabulous volunteers, including Elise Naknikian, Kitty Williston, Geraldine Maslanka, Jonathan Reese, and I'm not Corinne Barbanel, all of whom help us identify books and set up these events when they're in person, and also help us set it up virtually. And so our committee is going to be watching the chat and pulling out your questions, so I don't have to search for them over the space of hopefully 45 minutes to an hour that Dave and I will be talking about his new book, Unrigged. So let's dive right in, Dave. This is a wonderful read. I just raced through this book. But I would actually say to people who haven't read it yet, that it also is in very lovely, discrete bites. I could definitely see reading a chapter a day for the next week or so, because this is just right now such an empowering work. You wrote Rat Fucked, which told a really disturbing story about gerrymandering and how the Republican Party took advantage of the process and really used it to unfair advantage in a lot of, in the 2010 to 12 redistricting cycle. How did you hit on the topic of this book?
I was so depressed from going around the country talking about gerrymandering that I had to cheer myself up.
Well, I think you really succeeded. You're not only cheering yourself up, you are cheering the rest of us up.
Well,
and
that's good.
And I thought that I knew a lot about various grassroots efforts around the 2016 and 2018 election cycles. But there were some that you found that really were wonderful and that I hadn't been aware of. What research did you do to pick all of these amazing stories? How did you find them?
You know, it was so much fun. It was such an inspiring thing to do, to get to spend a year or more traveling the country embedded with these democracy groups that were doing such amazing work. I mean, it lifted my spirits. It really did. I mean, I'm serious. I was, so after Ratfuck came out, it had its media moment. I did some touring, and then, like most other wonky books about something boring, I thought it would disappear forever. And then the 2016 election happened, and sort of it had another moment as people sort of said, wait a second, if we're such a closely divided country, how come all the political power seems to be on one side, even when they win fewer votes? And I got to go back around and talk about it again. And there were these lovely rooms filled with activists and sort of newly woke people. And I would sometimes feel like I was sucking the air out of the room. Like there was this rain cloud over my head. And I wanted to get rid of the rain cloud, and I wanted to offer some hope. Like I had to find a way to give some hope at the end of my talk. So it wasn't, yeah, but this is pretty bad, but thanks for coming. And so I just started collecting examples to use at the end of my talk. You know, Katie Fahey in Michigan was a tremendous example of a citizen who, a couple days after the election, is thinking ahead to Thanksgiving in her house, and that you're going to have Democrats, Republicans, Trump voters, Sanders, Clinton people throwing mashed potatoes and gravy at each other, and she just couldn't take another day of it. And so she goes to Facebook and she posts, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. You want to do this with me? And she adds a smiley face emoji, and it leads to 430,000 signatures on a petition that nobody thought was possible. And they get on the ballot in Michigan, and they win with over 60% of the vote in November 2018. She's 27 years old and worked at a recycling nonprofit. And that's what she's able to build. So the book in some ways started with Katie, and then it started with Desmond Meade in Florida, who ran the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition that won back voting rights. 1.4 million former felons in Florida who, 10% of the adult population of Florida couldn't vote because of these laws that were essentially enshrined in Florida's constitution in the Jim Crow era. That's how long that they'd been there, and that was the intent of these laws, and they worked really well. And Desmond Meade himself was a former felon. He had been in prison on weapons charges, and got out of jail and was still homeless, and one day was ready to throw himself in front of a train in Miami, and he stands on the tracks, but the train doesn't come. And he walks across the tracks, and he ends up at a drug treatment center. And he checks himself in, and he gets clean. He goes back to college. He goes to law school. He gets his degree. But the one thing he can't get back is his right to vote. So he joins the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, ends up becoming its executive director. And they build this amazing, mighty moral coalition of left and right, black and white, young and old, churchgoers and former felons, and it's an amazing coalition. And they win in Florida with 64% of the vote in November 2018. Nothing wins with 64% of the vote these days, right? I mean, Florida elects Ron DeSantis governor and sends Rick Scott to the Senate in 2018. So it's not like it was some big blue wave that pushed this reform through. It happened because the left and right, Democrats, Republicans, all agreed that this was the right thing to do. And they built a coalition and persuaded people. And there were just these amazing stories out there. And we can get into more of them as we talk. But it was just such a privilege in the middle of a tough political moment to go out and spend time with these people and tell their stories.
Well, one of the things that really struck me about the stories that you were telling, and we know from Rafucked and from your journalism background, you're a great storyteller. But one of the things that I think really distinguished the book was the fact that you weren't just telling the story, you actually went out and worked with these folks, which is not what journalists and writers usually do, right? They have a story they want to tell, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but you actually went out and worked these issues. Can you talk a bit about that? Your Florida stories are they're all really terrific, But let's start with Florida and what you actually experienced.
You know, in the Florida chapter, I tell the story of Florida and also two other states of Alabama and Louisiana,
Yeah.
which had done similar work. And in Alabama, I joined the Alabama Voting Rights Project, which was kind of a joint effort sponsored by Campaign Legal Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you had something similar in Alabama that had happened in Florida. You had these Jim Crow era laws baked into the state's constitution that kept people from voting if they had a felony conviction. But in Alabama, it was even more serious. They had something called moral turpitude. And if you were convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude, you forfeited your voting rights forever. Except they didn't really define what moral turpitude was, which means that it was possible to have it apply to some felonies, but not others. So the Speaker of the House in Alabama gets caught embezzling millions of dollars. That's not moral turpitude, evidently. But if you were young and Black, often the smallest crime would be moral turpitude, and you would lose your voting rights. It did not affect as many people as it did in Florida. Alabama was a smaller state, but it was about 70,000 people. And finally, under threat of court order in 2016, Alabama decides that they will get rid of moral turpitude. But what they wouldn't do is actually help any of these people register to vote. So that they didn't actually publicize it, didn't tell anybody about it, wouldn't even print out the forms for people to get re-registered and hand them to parole officers or anything, you know. And as we all know from like Texas and North Carolina, if you make a mistake while voting in the South and you're not allowed to, you can end up back in prison. So people didn't know this was possible. So the Alabama Voting Rights Project essentially got together a team and they went out door to door and tried to do the work of registering these 70,000 people to vote again. And I joined them in Birmingham and Montgomery, which I mean are just amazing places to be if you're interested in voting. You know, and we're up in Birmingham, you know, 6 in the morning one day, heat of summer, going up to people trying to find out if we could register them. And, you know, so I'm sort of a middle-aged white guy, and you're walking up to people being like, so do you have a felony conviction? Can I register you to vote? They don't necessarily respond to that kind of approach. So you have to sort of, you know, they train you kind of how to walk up to people, how to begin broaching these topics, how to recognize when somebody might have a conviction in their past. And there was one woman told me a story I will just never forget. She was 17. She got arrested for marijuana possession as a senior in high school and lost her voting rights forever for you know, smoking a joint in high school. And it was, you know, she was 35, 36 at this point, and we registered her to vote on the spot that morning at the bus station. And she was in tears, I was in tears. She was like, all I wanted to do was vote for Barack Obama once in my life, and I couldn't do it, she said. And it was just so moving. And, you know, it was amazing. I was happy to put down my journalistic detachment and get to experience something like that.
Well, and it wasn't the only instance. I mean, that, as I said, is what distinguishes the book in a lot of ways, is that so many firsthand experiences. You know, one of the challenges we face actually in voter registration drives is exactly what you're talking about, which is how to be sensitive and find out, is there an underlying reason why somebody can't register that we might be able to fix or to correct misimpressions. I mean, here in New York, if you have finished your sentence and finished your parole, you are able to vote without anything further. We run across people all the time in voter registration drives who say, I can't register. I have a felony conviction, or, you know, I was incarcerated for a while. The whole sense from the South, from Alabama, from Florida, that if you've made a mistake once, that's it. for your citizenship is just really widespread. So, you know, how did you find the training? I'm curious if you remember any of it.
I do. I mean, I had done some citizen action canvassing as when I was back in high school. That was my summer job. So it was almost a throwback to those days. It's funny, I was in Connecticut as well, so it was with Connecticut Citizen Action under the leadership of a very young Miles Rappaport back in those days, for all the Common Cause veterans. But essentially what they wanted us to do is they trained us, and it was, was to, they wanted us to approach people, not, of course, by saying, so, do you have a felony conviction? It was a question of, I'm with the Alabama Voting Rights Project, and we're out here today telling people about a change in the law. And if you have, if you or someone that has a prior conviction in their past, and they think they might not be eligible to vote, actually, they are eligible to vote. Can I give you a little more information about it?
Yeah.
So it was, trying to not walk up to somebody and say, do you think you can't vote because of a conviction? And even when you approach people like that, they still don't always want to admit to a stranger the lowest point of their life, right? So you have to sometimes kind of recognize the sign that they're interested in more, and that if you keep talking, you may be able to help them.
What was also interesting to me about the Alabama and the Florida situation seemed to be very much grounded in a movement by the most affected people.
Yes.
Like Desmond Meade is the perfect example, but then there were others that you interacted with.
I think that's right. I mean, the Florida movement was very sophisticated. They raised a lot of money. They had the Brennan Center, ACLU, even the Koch brothers were among the funders of this. And they were able to do this really detailed polling and messaging designed to find exactly the right words to talk to people about this. Because in Florida, of course, you have to get 60% of the vote if you want to pass a constitutional amendment. If you win 50% plus one, that's not enough. So they had to find the language and to build a coalition that was nonpartisan. And what they hit on was this this idea of being eligible for a second chance. And in order to tell that story, they wanted people who had made mistakes and done good things once they had served their time, to sort of tell their stories. I mean, in Florida, it really is 10% of the adult population that had lost their voting rights. So what they assumed was that everybody knew somebody who was in that position, and that if you told these stories of a mistake and redemption, black, white, young, old, that these were your neighbors. And people sometimes thought, okay, well, some felon who did something awful, maybe they shouldn't vote again. But then they thought, oh, my next door neighbor, Bob, Bob's kind of a nice guy. I talked to Bob, I waved to Bob. I didn't realize that. Yes, of course, Bob ought to get to vote. So they wanted this to be about people and neighbors and stories and being eligible for a second chance.
So that's 10% of the voting population in Florida was unable to vote?
10% of the adult population, 25% of the black population of Florida had a felony conviction, was unable to vote.
Right. Wow. So I had heard of, obviously Second Chance and also the Michigan redistricting. A bunch of the things that you talk about are in states that have initiative processes. But even so, some of them were really surprising to me. I was not expecting the Utah story at all. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, we're in a blue state. We have these progressive notions about who cares about democracy. And one nice thing about the book is you explode that totally. And I think one of the strong ways you do is through the Utah story.
Thanks. It was amazing to me to watch. I mean, in 2018, there were 5 initiatives that won at the polls, and it was Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Utah, and Colorado.
Yeah.
So those aren't really blue states, right? I mean, Michigan, blue-ish, Colorado, purplish.
Purple, yeah.
But it won, it won in Missouri with 60-something% of the vote. It won in Ohio with 70-something% of the vote. And it squeaked through in Utah, but it squeaked through. Utah voted for redistricting reform. Its legislature has been kind of monkeyed around with it a little bit, but that's what happens. The history of voting rights in this country is not a straight line of progress. But what they mounted a really interesting campaign in Utah because they knew that you couldn't mount this based on progressive arguments. It had to be kind of, you had to convince people in Utah, in a comfortably one-party state, that this mattered and that it ought to matter to them. And they had a bunch of different ways of doing this. One is they made Ronald Reagan its spokesperson in many ways. And they had dug out these amazing old Reagan clips, and you can Google them. They're all up on YouTube, of Reagan talking about gerrymandering and being very articulate on why it's such a detriment to democracy. And they ran 30-second ads using Reagan as the spokesperson for this kind of reform. There were some Democrats who were involved as co-chairs, but most of the people who ran this were Republicans who thought a couple of things, who thought that representation in Utah had really gotten out of whack, that these lines were cutting up towns in such a way that local representation had really gotten skewed in unfair ways. And they set up their offices in a town called Holiday, Utah, which was actually in 3 different congressional districts and just as many state rep districts. And it was kind of a great example of, it's a town of 20,000 people. Why is it divided like this? Why don't they have one person who's actually speaking for them in Salt Lake City? But they were also really, really interested in sending a statement to the rest of the country that if Utah can do this, if Utah is willing to make this change, you all ought to do it. And they were really serious about sort of sending a message to the nation that this is important and you ought to do it. And that if Utah is willing to, come on, Massachusetts, come on, Connecticut, what's up? They were, lovely, inspiring activists who were very committed. They were very aware that it was not going to change anything politically in their states. It was not the same argument as, Michigan or something, where those lines have kept a party in charge that wins fewer votes. Nothing was going to change politically. It was about the nature of representation and the kind of example that Utah could set for the rest of the country.
Yes, and some of the other places that I didn't expect. I was really fascinated by the Sandpoint, Idaho story, because that to me, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of the microcosm of the argument that you were trying to make, because, you know, Sandpoint has been taken over in essence for a while by the most extreme far right wingers. I mean, just horrific nationalists, violent people. And they, and well, I'll let you tell the story to what happened.
I mean, Sandpoint is an amazing place. I mean, it's about as far north in Idaho as you can go and not be in Canada.
And Idaho is gorgeous. People don't realize how beautiful it is.
Oh, gorgeous out there, you know, and but it has, as you say, it's been taken over by sort of the American Redoubt movement, and folks who have come up there from, you know, other parts of the West, and they have really changed the nature. They've kind of turned it into a little, you know, right-wing encampment up in northern Idaho, and they were unable to get a school levy passed in Sandpoint. That they couldn't raise the money to fund the public schools, and there were a handful of young people who saw this on Facebook, and they had gone on to do other things. One of them was an associate professor at Columbia. Another one was in medical school, and they realized, hey, maybe we have some skills that could be useful. And they took a couple of weekends and they went out to Sandpoint and they organized the town, and they organized their side, and they kind of went door to door, and it worked. And they flipped. This levy had gone down 2-1 a couple of times in a row, and they went out and organized people and door knocked and kind of used their political science background, and they won. And they turned it around. They won 2-1, and then they were hungry to see what else they could do. They caught the activist bug, and they realized it's possible to persuade your neighbors to do the right thing if you knock on doors and talk to them.
Funny thing, there's nothing magical to it. It actually works. For those of you who've joined us late, we are talking with David Daley about his book, Unrigged. And if you haven't gotten it yet and you're interested in getting it, there's a link in the chat to a bit.ly address, and it is bit.ly/unrigged. That'll take you to the website of our friends at Greenlight Books, which is an independent bookstore in Brooklyn, struggling to survive through the closure of their 2 retail stores. And you can order it from an independent bookseller and by using that link. And we hope that if you are going to buy the book, help our friends at Greenlight. Let's keep independent businesses going. But it's not just initiatives, right? Because we're here in New York. We do not have an initiative process here in New York. So no matter how fired up we might get about something, we can't go out and petition and get something on the ballot and change the laws directly that way. And I can make an argument for why it's a good thing to be able to do that. And having spent decades in California, I can also make an argument for why it's not so great to have a completely boundless initiative process. But that's not the only activism that you looked at in the book. What other effective tactics were you able to find out there?
I would say that there's been a combination of initiative tactics on one hand, and then there's litigation on the other hand, some very effective litigation work. And then there's political organizing and attempting to sort of win, you know, doing the hard work of trying to win back some of these legislative chambers is, you know, very, very important. And you've got sort of a number of new groups and new who are, you know, in states where voter ID bills have been passed, there are organizations that are committed to trying to go out and find people that ID. Not just so they can vote, but because once you have an ID, you're able to do all of the other things that go along with it. An ID can help you turn your life around sometimes.
I was going to say, and I thought the Cat Calvin story was a really striking one, because people think, oh, what's the big deal? You just go get an ID.
You know, and it's not that simple. If you don't have one, there's probably a reason why you don't have one. And it might be because it's really inconvenient sometimes. Maybe you have 3 kids and a job during the day, and you're a single parent, and you just can't find the time to go off and get that ID. And maybe you ride public transportation to work and don't need it to drive, so it's not a priority. Maybe it's because it's a $100 process to go get it, and that's just not in the budget that week. Or maybe it's because you have to have 3 other forms of ID in order to get the driver's license, and you lost your social security card and you can't go through the process of that. And sometimes, frankly, it's because the state doesn't want you to get that ID. And they've passed this law for a political purpose, and then they make it difficult to also get the ID. You see that in Alabama, where a voter ID bill is passed, and then they slash the hours of the driver's license bureaus in the, around Birmingham and Montgomery. So it's harder for Black voters to go in and get that ID. Or it's the story I tell in North Dakota, where a very specific voter ID bill is passed aimed at preventing Native American voters from voting. If you are in the tribal land up in North Dakota, first the ID demanded the one thing that you didn't have, a street address. But then if you also wanted to go get that ID, the driver's license bureau is located in Rolla, North Dakota, and it's open about 3 hours every month. So if you can't make it for those 3 hours, and it opens, I think, at 10, and then it closes at 11:30 for lunch, and then it opens up again at 2 for like another hour. And if you can't get up there during those 3 hours, and your tribal land is probably 3 hours away, and you might have kids, and you're taking the entire day off to go get that ID. So I've really taken your question in another direction. Your question is about some of the other tactics. But I mean, Cat Calvin.
That was straight on organizing, right?
Yeah.
Because the idea, I mean, the time frame in North Dakota was really striking, because the Native American activists, and again, they're people advocating for themselves, it's not somebody coming from outside and telling them what to do. They had barely a month. And just like Cat Calvin came up with the obvious solution, which is, okay, we're stuck with voter ID. We think it's a lousy idea, but okay, let's get people IDs. In the Indian tribes, they said, okay, they are forcing us to have IDs with street addresses. We don't have street addresses. Let's get street addresses.
And they contract with a professor in California who's a master at a geographic information system, GIS mapping. And they plotted coordinates of all of their homes, and they gave them street addresses, and they bought machines to press IDs, and they burned those machines out. They made so many IDs. And voter turnout surged in 2018. It did not decline. And one of the most amazing things that happens is a woman named Ruth Buffalo is elected to North Dakota's State House. She is the first Native American woman to be elected to the State House in North Dakota, and she defeats the author of the original voter ID bill. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is why you have to go out and tell these stories. you couldn't possibly make it up.
And over in the book, it seemed to me that we were hearing people say, damn it, they are trying to keep me from voting, and that means I have to try harder. So, I mean, and back to Kat Colvin, because I thought she really did something very, very unusual, and she didn't just stop with the voter ID.
I think it's exactly right, because, and I mean, Kat is terrific. And what she argues is you can't just you can't just tell people that we want you to show up and vote once, and that we're getting you this ID so you can vote. People who are lacking IDs often have more problems than that. They have bigger issues than just voting. So by trying to address the entire individual and to really help them step up and step ahead, it's a more effective way. You know, it's not just, you know, in a campaign, if you only knock on somebody's door when you want their vote, it's not particularly useful, right? But if you check in with them, if you talk to them more often, you bring them along, and I think that really is her goal.
Yeah, which is, you know, and again, it's the power of the individual, not just taking things for granted, not just saying, okay, this is the way it is, there's nothing I can do, but actually just tackling it in the most amazing way. But I do have a bone to pick with you.
Sure.
Chapter 10, which I also really like,
yep.
But it's unlike the rest of the book. It's very much about groups at the national level coming up with this idea and then allegedly coming in and running candidates and flipping legislatures. I have to tell you, from the on-the-ground experience here in New York State, where exactly the kind of activists that you're talking about and exactly the kind of effort that you talk about in chapter 10 flipped the New York Senate after what, 40 decades of dominance by a diminishing Republican Party. From on the ground, it didn't feel like somebody from some national organization came in and told True Blue or No IDC or the local indivisibles that this would be a good idea to run candidates.
You know, what Common Cause has done to win these reforms and to make New York a fairer electoral state. I mean, you and your team have done more than anybody. So those reforms that you achieved were so hard won and hard earned, and you deserve all of the credit for them. And congratulations and thanks for them, because you have fought for them for so long against such odds, and to finally achieve the magnificent packages of reforms that passed in New York are so meaningful and so influential, and they're going to matter in 2020 as well. You know, these are reforms that are going to make it easier to vote, you know, in a pandemic, in an emergency. I mean, all of this is so far-sighted and amazing. So my hat's off. I certainly wasn't trying to suggest that there were outsiders who sort of came in and set those things in motion. The story I wanted to tell in that chapter was of groups that recognized that state politics matter and local politics matter, and that one of the reasons, and I don't want to sound partisan, but I'm chronicling these groups that understood that their party and their ideals and their issues got set back significantly in 2010 because their side did not show up in a midterm election. It was a redistricting year and they got wiped out across all of these states. The National Democratic Party didn't know how to fix it. And what you saw was a resurgence of energy among groups like Run for Something and Sister District and Flippable, who recognized that local politics mattered, and they set out to kind of rebuild things from the ground up, not from the White House down, but from the ground up. And that's really, really hard to do these days, in part because gerrymandering made it really hard to do, right? I mean, in Georgia in 2016, 81% of all state house districts didn't have a member of the other party competing in them because of gerrymandering, because it was such a crazy race. It was like, why bother? So, and even if you did get a candidate, it wasn't a good candidate. Wisconsin and North Carolina, it was over 50%. You know, a lot of states, it was just a wild number. Ohio has all of these districts, and I think you had something like 4 races in Ohio for the state house that were within 5% in 2018. So to get young people, millennials, people of color interested in standing up and running for these seats, I think is a really important thing, and that these folks have done really good work.
Indeed. I mean, and that's one of the things that I value about the book is the fact that you are willing to look at the state level and explain to people why it can't be from only looking at it from the White House down. But that brings me to the final chapter that I want to talk about, and then we're going to open it up for questions from folks who've been patiently drinking wine with us for the last 45 minutes or so. And that is the election protection chapter, because that is a somewhat different story, but I think a really important one.
I mean, it was amazing for me to spend, I tried to think about where I wanted to spend Election Day 2018 as I wrote this. Did I want to be in Michigan with Katie Fahey and her group, or did I want to be in Florida with Desmond Meade, or in Utah as, you know, San Juan County finally flipped to, a Navajo Board of Commission. And I thought, no, the most important place to be is going to be at the election protection hotline, and trying to tell the stories of some of these, lawyers and individuals who are spending their time trying to help people who have showed up to vote and can't for whatever reason. And it was amazing to kind of be in the headquarters as, so on one hand, there's all of these lawyers who are doing, you call up, hi, I'm in Georgia. They're telling me I need this ID to vote. I don't think I do I? No, you don't. Go back and tell them. And if they insist on it, we'll file a lawsuit. But they also have like this Twitter hub, which was unlike anything I had ever seen before. And they have all of these hashtags and all of these keywords loaded up, and they are monitoring Twitter, looking for like Russian bots or anybody who's trying to throw the election off somehow. Anybody who is saying, when you vote on election day, Wednesday, November 9th, they jump right in underneath it and they say, oh no, election day is Tuesday, November 8th. And if you're having a trouble, the election protection hotline is right here. All of these things, they are immediately jumping in and trying to be the first voice someone hears on Twitter whenever there's any sort of misinformation being bandied about or, fake news going around. They are there on it. It's a high-tech, impressive operation.
So thank you for the shout out for the work we've done here in New York, but I just wanted to point out, you talk about Jack Mumby in the book as a volunteer. In actuality, he's a digital campaigner for Common Cause in our national office. So he works with Jesse Littlewood. And we at Common Cause are very heavily involved in the election protection efforts. So delighted to hear your pleasure at what I know the team that we work with at the national level was able to do.
Super cool. It was super cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. They felt really excited about it. They were talking about it for days. Election protection is such a huge effort. And there are these call centers in large law firms in various locations. Los Angeles has one, Chicago has one, and as you can imagine, there is a gigantic one here in New York City, which, I mean, a huge number of the Wall Street law firms collaborate on. And there are literally hundreds of lawyers and paralegals in these gigantic, very plush law firm conference rooms taking the phone calls. But in addition, there are grassroots volunteers, and I have a feeling that some of the people on this call probably have volunteered with us.
Thank you.
For past presidential elections on the ground here in New York as election protection monitors. So read the chapter on election protection and the hotline, but know that you have an opportunity here in New York to volunteer to help people at polling places, probably not in June, where we're not going to have a lot of in-person voting, but hopefully, you know, everything willing, with good fortune, that we'll be voting in person in November, and we're going to need a lot of volunteers to help people. And we're also going to be doing a huge amount of outreach, a lot of voter education and outreach, social media, but we're trying to figure out how we can do postcards, how we can do phone calling to let voters know here in New York that the presidential primary is no longer in April. Probably most of you on the phone are plugged in enough to know that the governor has, at our request and the request of many others, postponed the April 28th primary to June 23rd. But it's going to be very difficult for all voters to know what's going on, and we're really going to be starting very soon to get the word out so that people don't expect to vote on April 28th, and they know what's happening, that the primary has been moved and consolidated with the June 23rd primary, all stuff that we can do here. And the other things that we're working on, not surprisingly, are trying to help our legislature stay focused and do the people's business, even during this time of trauma. If we all can do a book event through Zoom, it seems to me like the legislature ought to be able to figure out how to do the people's business while we continue to pay them a higher salary, which all of Common Cause New York advocated for. So this is not the time for them to give up, and they're going to need to hear from us, their constituents, about that. Dave, am I right that you probably have a copy of the book near to hand?
I could get up and get one, yes.
Okay, would you? Because I'm going to ask you to read your final chapter.
Oh, gosh. Let's see. All right.
If not, I'll have to read it, but I prefer to have you do it.
What would you like?
Literally the final paragraph of the book is how I'd like to end our discussion. On, let's see.
This will be the defining battle of our times. The lesson of Katie Fahey, Desmond Meade, Idaho's Luke Mayville, Stephanie Hoffler, who you all at Common Cause know very well, let alone the tens of thousands of volunteers whose names we don't know, is that all of us have it within us to create great change. We do not need superheroes or the perfect presidential candidate to save us. We must find the courage to step forward and be the solutions ourselves. Voters, not politicians, Reclaim Idaho, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition prove that when we build coalitions, creatively harness our abilities and stand together for equality, we win. Let us find hope in the energy and devotion of our fellow citizens. Let us commit, all of us, to building a nation in which every voice is heard and carries the same weight. Let us move into the battles ahead bravely and unafraid, understanding the challenges, but also the stakes, confident that with hard work and constant dedication, the country we want to live in lies within our grasp.
A fitting end to our discussion about taking back our democracy. And the prelude to our letting you know, I started to talk about some of the ways in which you can get involved, because it needs every single one of us. We're going to put up a poll and ask if you'd like to be part of an action team that gets the first word on the various grassroots activities and helps us step up the activism. Want to let you know that we're now doing virtual town halls every Thursday. We're taking off this week for Passover, but starting next week we'll resume, and it's Thursday at 6:30 to 8. And tomorrow you're going to get an email about our Democracy Doesn't Pause campaign, where we have ways to communicate with our elected representatives to let them know that we expect them to keep doing the people's business, just like those of us who are working remotely are doing, you know, our daily tasks. And we're also, if you would want more information about election protection, let us know as we start to gear up that process. And also to let you know that we're floating the idea of a democracy book club. Would be the first discussion. We're lucky enough to have Dave Daley with us today. Probably not going to have authors for all of our discussions, but we're interested in finding out if you would like this idea. And if you have ideas for books that you think we should all be reading together and discussing, send us an email with suggestions at nyoffice@commoncause.org. And we're also, because we're all stuck at home, we thought it would be fun perhaps to have a democracy watch club. And maybe on a given week, we all watch the same movie at our leisure or a documentary. And then we get on a Zoom call and have an opportunity to discuss it. So we'd like to know if that's an idea that's interesting to you. And if you have films or documentaries you think would be interesting to discuss with other democracy activists, then let us know at New York office at commoncause.org. And we're going to put up, I'm sorry?
Slay the Dragon just came out on.
That, absolutely. Slay the Dragon. It's a new documentary. And it features
part
Kate.
on my last book, and that tells an amazing story about gerrymandering in Michigan, and it's streaming as of last Friday. Highly recommended.
Yeah, it's riveting, and it features Katie, who Dave talks about in the book, and and the filmmakers were lucky enough to get hooked into this effort, not knowing how it was going to turn out. So they really were there every step along the way of the initiative process. And even knowing the ending, you're at the edge of your seat. It's very, very well done. So we're putting up a poll. If you click polling at the bottom of your screen on the icon, it'll bring you to the page where you can answer our questions as we, and also there's a link to the survey in the chat. So we're asking you to answer our questions while we get Dave to answer yours. So Ida Messina has a question. Didn't Florida figure out a way to still deny felons the right to vote? What's happening with that issue now? Dave, do you have the latest?
It's going to end up in the courts. I mean, what happened is that Florida's gerrymandered legislature essentially added all of these new restrictions on top of the amendment that was not what the people voted for. They essentially added a poll tax back on top of this. So it is not necessarily the happiest of endings, but it's not over yet. Here's what I would say. The amendment restored voting rights for 1.4 million people. After this poll tax was added onto it, it meant somewhere between 350,000 and 600,000 people would be able to vote immediately. which is still, pretty good. That's still an amazing leap forward. But this is working its way through the courts, and there were some terrific rulings in favor of the amendment just last week. It's probably going to end up before the US Supreme Court, which means anything could happen. But it's advancing through the courts, and the rulings so far have been in favor of the amendment. So I remain optimistic about this. But I think it's really important, and I think this is a great opportunity to talk about this. All of the victories that we talk about in this book, in many ways, a lot of them got eroded. In Michigan, the gerrymandered legislature tried to make it hard to fund the new independent commission. In Idaho, after they had their success expanding Medicaid, the legislature made it harder for other groups in the future to get an initiative through. In Florida, obviously, the poll tax being enacted on top of something that 64% of the people said that they wanted to have happen is truly an insulated and arrogant legislature that feels it's above the people's will. But the history of voting rights in this country is not a straight line. And if it was, we would have fixed this with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Yeah. It wasn't fixed in the 1870s. It wasn't fixed with the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. And it wasn't fixed in 2018 when 15 of 16 democracy initiatives won at the polls. It is only fixed when we all stay engaged and involved and active constantly. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about the moral arc of the universe being long, but bending towards justice. And it does not bend towards justice on its own. It bends towards justice when all of us, you and me and Common Cause and everybody, steps on that arc, grabs it with both hands and pulls it in the direction that we want it to go. And we have to leave our hands on that arc. You can't just we can't just have our hands on the arc in presidential election years. We've got to have it on the arc at all times, because there are folks who are trying to pull it in the other direction. And the history is it zigs and zags.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a work in constant evolution to improve and protect our democracy. Lois has a question. Why do you think young people's voting rates are so low, and what is the best way to fix this?
That's a good question.
Well, part of it is what you point out in the chapter. There are actually voter suppression efforts to discourage young people from voting.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are serious, and they're strong and surgical. I mean, I was the reporter who kind of first got his hands on Thomas Hofeler's secret redistricting files, and I've written about this in a number of publications. But when you look through Hofeler's redistricting files, he was involved in efforts in North Carolina to add a new voter ID bill that passed in 2013, that big kind of omnibus, awful bill. And then when Hofeler redrew all of the state legislative maps, I found in his files these databases, addresses of every single college student in the state at their dorms with all of these fields. And one of the fields is whether or not they had a driver's license. So they cross-referenced this, intentionally trying to figure out who did and didn't have a driver's license, because they knew that they could put them in certain districts, but if they had a vote, knowing that they wouldn't actually be able to vote. And like, that's the specificity of the kinds of suppression tactics that students are up against. You know, I talk about a case in Florida, which I think is amazing. You had students at the University of Florida who said, hey, why can't the University of Florida be a voting site? We're the largest employer, and this is where everybody in town lives and works and congregates, they had the voting site about 3 miles away from the university. So, you know, kids did a lot of cool things, and they rented buses and they tried to drive folks back and forth, but it's not the same thing as being able to vote in the student union, right? And the state said, no, we won't do that. And we will intentionally write into our bill that these voting centers can't be on college campuses. And so they sued and they won. And then Florida's gerrymandered legislature comes back and says, okay, well, maybe they can be on college campuses, but they can only be on college campuses when there's sufficient parking available for everybody. So the forces that are lined up with their hands on the arc going the other way don't ever stop. And they are really focused on student voting in a long and serious way. It's amazing how whenever you see long lines of people voting, it never seems to be in sort of, you know, it's never in Westport, Connecticut. It's always on a college campus or
A Black neighborhood.
Or in a Black neighborhood. And I don't think that is a coincidence.
No, not at all. Here's a question from Donna. Why were the Koch brothers funding voter registration in Florida?
It's a great question.
It's a shock to us, but go ahead.
They believe in these criminal justice reforms. There are some radical criminal justice minds inside the Koch brothers organization, and they were, you know, very much interested in trying to get felons voting again, former felons. Now, 75% of them are white people in Florida, so maybe they did the math and assumed that there was a percentage that it would be conservative voters. I don't know how deeply they went into this, but I feel like they've been pretty consistent on criminal justice issues as far as second chances go. Now, on the other hand, the Koch brothers were also helping fund the work against the initiative in Michigan. They were helping fund the work against the Medicaid expansion initiative in Idaho. So they were on the wrong side. I found them on the wrong side of, you know, many of the things I wrote about here, but they're on the right side of this one.
Yeah. Okay, here is a question from Kathy Schrager. How has the withering of local newspapers affected the activists you wrote about?
I think it's a serious problem. The withering of local newspapers is a major problem of democracy. And I say this as somebody who, you know, came up cutting his teeth in regional papers around the country, that I've just seen collapse. And I fear that this virus that could, you know, help finish off. It's really hard to get the word out if you're in Michigan and you're trying to run an anti-gerrymandering initiative, or in Idaho and running the Medicaid initiative, or Florida, it's really hard to get coverage when there are fewer reporters, when there are fewer reporters, you know, focused on local news. And there are fewer people on the state capitol beats in all of these places. And that allows politicians to get away with murder oftentimes, you know. I'm sure you see it in Albany all the time. The lack of accountability journalism, of investigative journalism. I mean, politicians know it, and they're able to get away with more than they were when there were bigger bureaus and more people investigating and keeping them honest.
Just today on Twitter, one of the reporters that I follow in the Legislative Correspondents Association, who works for the Gannett papers, put on his Twitter feed that he was on a ordered hiatus from his job for budget cutting, and that he wouldn't be tweeting for the next week while he was on unpaid hiatus. So it's a real challenge. Question from Corinne Barbanel. How did you find these activists?
It's a good question. I would find, I'd find accounts of what was happening. I would talk to people and they turned me on to somebody else. I mean, I spent time with some groups that I couldn't tell the story in a full chapter often. So there were a lot of other ones that sort of got left out. But, the 5 big redistricting initiatives were all fairly major campaigns. So it was really fun to be able to kind of join along on those. And then it was just trying to present a good mix of other pieces. So I wanted to, from different parts of the country that affected different kinds of people to try to, round out a story. I didn't want it to be all a bunch of redistricting stories. So I went to Maine and told the ranked choice voting story, and Florida for felon reenfranchisement, and Utah and North Dakota and Nevada and Arizona on the Native American beat. And I profiled these amazing mathematicians who have been central to a lot of the gerrymandering cases, who have really seen through a lot of the efforts by the legislatures to draw their maps. So it was really a joy.
And a good detective work. From Tom Bergdahl, I expect many states to move to vote by mail, or at least no excuse absentee voting. If they lose, the GOP will scream fraud. How can they be assured that is not the case?
The voter fraud myth it's amazing how tenacious it clings in this country. We don't have a voter fraud problem in this country, period. And one of the chapters in the book, I tell the story of Chris Kobach through 2 stories. One is the demise of the Voter Fraud Commission that he co-chaired, and then the other is the demise of his voter ID bill in Kansas at the hands of Dale Ho and the ACLU. And we do not have a voter fraud problem. I mean, Justin Levitt did this masterful look at every vote that was cast in America between, 2002 and 2014, and it's hundreds of millions of votes, and he found 34 examples of possible alleged double voting. 34 cases out of, hundreds of millions, if not billions of votes. And yet there's this false sense that we have a voter fraud problem because some politicians find it useful to keep saying. And we don't. And I think we need to be really, really clear that we don't have a voter fraud problem. And that vote by mail has imperfections, but we need to begin this process of moving towards it. And we've got less than 200 days. And it's not going to be easy. And we absolutely have to be certain that there's in-person options for people who need in-person options, that there's translation options for people who need translation. But we can't ask people to choose between their health and their right to vote. I mean, what's happening in Wisconsin tomorrow seems almost inconceivable, that the Supreme Court there is now counteracting the governor's order not to hold the primary. They're going to force in-person voting tomorrow in Wisconsin in the middle of a pandemic, which it just seems so nonsensical. We don't know.
Very politically designed.
And it's, I mean, even if it's not politically designed, it's still nonsensical. It's awful. I mean, I do think that there's political purposes here. There's a key Supreme Court seat that's up in Wisconsin. If this was just a Democratic primary, it would not be as contentious. But the next 10 years of Wisconsin's maps are also up tomorrow. So it's more contentious than it would be. And it is, so there's a lot of work to do, but we need to be thinking about it. You see the chaos in Wisconsin, the chaos in Ohio, you see these legal cases the day before an election. We've got to be planning for it. Vote by mail is nonpartisan. It doesn't help either side. It helps Americans not have to choose between their right to vote and their health. And we need to not have a public health crisis turn into a constitutional crisis. And we could be heading that way.
So, but also, Tom, I think also practically speaking, in response to your question, there are things that can be done. And that goes to what Dave was saying, which is the changes need to happen now. We need the legislature to pass the necessary changes to our law, to expand absentee voting, to streamline the application process. And then we need the boards of elections to set up transparent processes and standards that are going to be applied. Sending out the ballots, tracking them, adding barcodes, tracking them through the mail, letting people call in to find out their ballot has been received and has been counted, and setting up standards for the signature matching, and doing all of that in a way that New York almost never does, which is transparently. And the states that are successful with vote by mail programs are the states that have those kinds of controls in place, and it's possible for people to see the ballots being opened, being counted, the signature verification, and it just puts the lie to the persistent myth that there's going to be fraud. Recognizing that in New York, to the extent there has been any fraud problem, it tends to be with absentee ballots. Look what happened down in North Carolina. We've got a couple of instances, and it turns out it's usually coercion more than actual fraud. It's people going into nursing homes and telling people how they should vote and helping them fill out their ballots. But there can be controls for all of these things. And I think in this instance, it's something we're going to have to look to our election administrators to do, and that we're going to have to help them figure out what those processes are. A question from Lois. Haven't there been instances of people jailed for voting by provisional ballot when they weren't eligible, or when registered in more than one state? Any ideas how to address people who are afraid, or people who are dropped from the rolls and afraid to cast a provisional ballot? Dave, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I think that the most famous case probably is in Texas, right, where you had a woman who has been jailed for several years now for believing she had the right to vote back, casting a provisional ballot, winding up in jail. There's a couple cases in North Carolina as well. In almost all of these cases, people have not been able to prove that this was intentional or malicious. It's people who genuinely believe that they had their right to vote back, cast a provisional ballot, trying to be certain, and when they didn't, they were made an example of, really. And I think that that's what is happening. You see intentionally complicated laws, and then you see enforcement come down in a disproportional way on a handful of people, and it scares others off. I've been so nonpartisan up until now, but I think that this is intentional, and I think that when you look at the kind of voter fraud that has happened, who did the voter fraud in North Carolina 9? That's the best example of voter fraud in this country in recent history. It was absentee ballot fraud done on behalf of a Republican congressional candidate. So it's fundamentally not the kind of voter fraud that gets talked about is fundamentally not a problem.
Yeah. So Lois, I think in that situation that you're talking about, how do you help people get over that fear? I think knowledge is the most effective way that you can. It's by assuring people, by providing them with we have a handout, for instance, that Let New York Vote is prepared, that the New York Civil Liberties Union is prepared. We've adapted for Common Cause's registration efforts, and it details exactly what the law is for people who are formerly incarcerated to know whether they are or are not entitled to vote. And this is where the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline comes in. That's the election protection hotline that Dave was talking about. And Stephanie, no, it wasn't Stephanie, Linda Wintner. No, we aren't talking about the New York Democratic Lawyers Council. They do something different. We're talking about the election protection hotline, which is a national nonpartisan hotline. The New York Democratic Lawyers Council does great stuff, but they are the Democratic lawyers, and these folks are strictly nonpartisan civil rights lawyers. So providing information and telling people who are frightened where they can go to check their status and get reliable information, I think is the best thing that we can do. Let's see, from David Lowe, do you think ranked choice voting will encourage more young voters as candidates they support are more likely to be on the ballot? Should passing ranked choice voting be a priority?
I hope so. I love ranked choice voting. You know, I love the idea that an election ought to have a majority winner, that there ought to, you know, that a ranked choice creates this kind of automatic instant runoff that assures that the candidate who wins has the support of the most voters. I love that it allows for more parties and more voices to run without feeling like they're going to be spoilers. I think it broadens the conversation. I think it's really, really important in party primaries because in so many districts around the country, the general election is uncompetitive, but the election that really matters is the party primary, and that's held in June or July. It's super low turnout. It's the, you know, it's usually the you know, most extreme base voters of either side, and so you end up with you know, if there's 4 or 5 people running in that race, you can win with 36, 37% of the vote. There was a congressional primary in Massachusetts in 2016, I think it was, that was won at 21% of the vote. And once you've won the congressional Democratic primary in Massachusetts, you've won the general. So 21% of the vote, it's not enough. It means 79% of the people wanted somebody else. And the beauty of ranked choice is that it gets you to 50% plus 1. And I think it re-incentivizes politicians to behave in a different way once they're in office. They don't have to think about that primary anymore. They can be thinking about consensus building and governing and problem solving instead of, well, if I do this, I'll be upsetting the people who turn out for my low turnout primary.
And happily, sorry, allergies. Next year in New York City, we're going to get a chance to really see how ranked choice voting works. I've gotten a comment asking from somebody who says she's 2/3 of the way through the book, but what about New York examples?
Yeah. You know, I didn't tell a lot of New York examples. Maybe it's because I live in Massachusetts, so I guess I was going out trying to tell more stories. I think the best New York examples probably happened when you all won your big reforms, and that was really, you know, a legislative story. And this is a little bit more of a campaign and an initiative and activism story.
So this actually, I would have to say, I mean, I really understand why you wouldn't have spent time in the book on this story, But the reforms came about because of a very broad coalition that was made up of organizations and grassroots activists, not just the organizations, that spent 3 years with a relentless drumbeat about early voting and other reforms. So I would say that it was very much a result of exactly the kind of activism that you're talking about, the energy of people who hadn't really paid attention to democracy before 2016, woke up just smacked in November and said, oh geez, this cannot go on, and looked around and said, what the hell is going on in New York that our voting system is so bad, and organized and convinced, made it a campaign issue in that swing year of 2018. So the timing was perfect, that when the True Blues, the no IDCs, the folks who were listening to the national folks who said, run candidates, swing your legislature. When the new legislature came in, they had to run on, we will do election reform. Yeah. So
election reform is
different strands from your book that came together in New York.
I think that's right. Election reform is the start of everything. It doesn't matter what your #1 issue is on whatever side you're on, election reform is the start of it all.
So I'm going to remind everybody, if you haven't already filled out the poll, please do. We want to stay in touch with you. We want to know what you are interested in, how you want to be active, and help you find your inner activist. And so we need information from you in order to do that. And of course, you can go to the Greenlight Bookstore website and order the book. As I said at the beginning, it's a terrific read. I think you'll find it, particularly at this time when we are feeling kind of isolated and scared about what's happening. A chapter a day will definitely be an antidote to the feeling of things are falling apart. Dave tells a lot of wonderful stories in the book, and I hope it will inspire you to become or stay active and know that together we can really make a difference. So Natalie just put up the survey again. And again, if you're going to buy the book, support Greenlight Bookstore. It's greenlightbookstore.com. Just put in Unrigged. The page will pop up. There's a link to the book right there. And we can support our independent booksellers while we get a good dose of optimism and voter empowerment from Dave's wonderful book. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining this. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.